If you were with us the last time, you found out that when this country first emerged, there was a lot of people that were not exactly on the same page with respect to what kind of government that they wanted to see. With respect to things like a stronger central government or a weaker central government. We were introduced to something called the Articles of Confederation, which were established in 1777, and they set up a weak central government because we just so happen to be fighting a strong centralized governing power, in other words, Great Britain. And so one of the things that we had really thought is when we do achieve our freedom and our independence, we don't want to make the same mistake that our British cousins made. And so therefore, the idea behind the Articles of Confederation as it relates to a weak central government is that if you make centralized power weaker and more stretched thinner, ultimately you won't have the same problems that you saw in the 1760s with a big, intrusive, abusive, tyrannical federal government. Okay? And then we found out there were very specific reasons in terms of why the British were doing what they were doing. There were reasons that they were implementing taxes. There were reasons that they were saying, look, our law is supreme and it cannot be questioned. We found that out in the aftermath of the American Revolution. Well, in the 1780s, what you begin to see is the rise of what we call a nationalist faction. And these are people like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, George Washington. And these are people that understand the errors of their ways and that there needs to be a stronger federal government. Not only does it make sense from an organizational standpoint, every once in a while, like in the case of Shays' Rebellion, it's actually very convenient to have a strong central government capable of dealing with problems like that. All of these guys come together behind closed doors in 1784 in Philadelphia. It comes to be known as the Philadelphia Convention. The whole point of the Philadelphia Convention is to find ways to strengthen the federal government at the same time that they protect the liberties and the freedoms that we fought for and were so near and dear to our hearts in the American Revolution. Okay? So one of the things that is proposed at the Philadelphia Convention is a plan from James Madison, who was from Virginia, and so they called it the Virginia Plan. The way that I always like to think about the Virginia Plan is that it was a stronger federal government, central government on steroids, right? In addition to allowing the central government to do things like tax people directly or resolve issues between the states, it would have allowed the federal government to simply knock down state laws that it did not like for whatever reason. Okay, so you could have a state that has a policy of not taxing the income of its constituents. If the government doesn't like this, central government, doesn't like this, according to the Virginia Plan, it can come in and enforce a state income tax law. Okay. Now, a lot of people that showed up were very much of the mindset that the government did need more power, but they were also realists, and they said, look, Madison, there's no way I can sell this to the people back in, New Jersey or back in New York or back in South Carolina. It's just not going to happen. So ultimately, they don't adopt the Virginia Plan, and instead, they adopt something called the New Jersey Plan. Now, the New Jersey Plan did strengthen the powers of the federal government, but at the same time, it allowed the states to retain some of the very important powers that were relevant to people living in those particular regions. In other words, there were laws that were very different from North Carolina to New York, and the predominant reason for that is because the economy was different, the demography was different. There was a lot of differences, and therefore there ought to have some discretionary room at a state level to implement laws that are designed specifically to handle the problems and the issues of your states. Now, for your notes, the New Jersey Plan would ultimately be kind of like a blueprint for what would later become known as the Constitution. But before we go any further, I want to talk about the way that government has been set up. At this point, we've got three branches of government. We've got the executive branch, which would be the president, and he or she is responsible for executing the laws, enforcing the laws. You've got your legislative branch. That would be Congress. They legislate. They make laws. And you've got your judicial. okay? And the judicial branch says what the law is, okay? Now, the basic problem is how much representation should each state have, okay? So for instance, in a state like Texas, you've got a lot of people, you've got a lot of geography, and so therefore Texas can make the claim that the laws that come out of Washington will affect us in a manner that is quite disproportional to a state like, for instance, Wyoming. There's not a lot of people that live in Wyoming. So Texas can make the claim, we ought to have more say in Washington, considering the laws that come out of there are going to affect a lot more Texans than they are people in Wyoming. And so it made sense that Texas and other large states like New York and, in this day and age, California, Illinois, they have more people sent to Washington simply because they have more people living in their respective states. Well, obviously, that piqued the interest of the smaller states. And back during this time period, the one small state that I'd like you to be mindful of, that would be South Carolina. Now, South Carolina was worried about a lot of things, but they were worried about what they called the tyranny of the majority. In other words, there could be a policy that is popular throughout much of the larger portions of the United States that may not be very beneficial to South Carolina. In other words, how do we protect the smaller states from being dominated by the bigger states? And one of the ways that they propose doing this is a bicameral house. In other words, Congress consists of two houses, an upper house, which is the Senate, and a lower house, which is the House of Representatives. So a law is proposed in the House of Representatives. Just for example, everybody needs to wear sandals on Friday, all right? It's going to be a federal law. Well, before it can become the law of the land, it needs to be approved by the Senate. And if the Senate doesn't like it, it can strike it down. If it makes it out of the Senate, it's at that point that after the president signs it into law that it becomes an official law. Now, the way that I always like to think about the bicameral house, it's an idiot check, right? It'll catch a bad law before a bad law can become a law. Now, what states like South Carolina and other smaller states are proposing is allow the larger states more representation in the House of Representatives so that they're satisfied from a standpoint that they have more people, they now have more representation. But in the Senate, every state, no matter how big, no how small, will only have 2 senators. So Texas, Wyoming, Massachusetts, Illinois, Vermont, Florida, West Virginia, you name it. They all have 2 senators. And the way that this is seen is a way for the smaller states to kind of stand up for their interests so that even if there is a law, for example, a law that would outlaw slavery, it very well may make it out of the House of Representatives, considering during this time period more people live in the northern part of the United States where slavery is dying out than do in states like South Carolina where slavery is legal. In this case, the Senate, where everybody has equal representation, will be able to protect the interests of South Carolina to that end. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. Now, I've always considered this compromise with the larger states allowing the smaller states to have equal representation in the Senate as one of the big mistakes made in the early days of the American Republic, because ultimately what this is going to do is it's going to amount to what I call the tyranny of the minority. Now, the South was a minority in terms of the House of Representatives, but it was a very powerful minority in the sense that it could put pressure on northern congressmen through the Senate by saying, look, if you're going to take out the institution of slavery, there very well may be institutions that we might not be so inclined to vote for unless you're more reasonable to that end. And so, from my perspective, it's a situation where you've got an institution like slavery that very well may have gone away democratically, small d democratically, but is preserved. And one of the big reasons for that is because you do have a really powerful voting bloc in the Senate when it comes to some of these smaller states like South Carolina. Now, South Carolina was given a huge victory with this great compromise. But one of the other things that I want you to be mindful of is they were not satisfied with this alone. What they wanted to do is add more representation in the House of Representatives to really ensure that there would never be a law that came out that made slavery unconstitutional. And so to that end, what they wanted to start doing is start counting their slaves as people that needed representation. Now, if you're from Massachusetts, where there is no slavery, this is a pretty bitter pill to swallow, considering those slaves are not going to be treated as citizens. The entire point of slavery is to produce a class of people that have no political voice or political rights. And so when South Carolina maintained that these people would not be given citizenship rights, there was another compromise that came to pass. That's what's called the Three-Fifths Compromise. Okay? In order to get a national constitution ratified, the bigger states like New York and Virginia and Massachusetts would ultimately have to find ways of settling their disputes with the smaller states, including people like South Carolina. And so they said, we're not going to go ahead and give you direct one-to-one representation for your African-American slaves. They're not citizens. We've already established that. What we will do, if you'll be cooperative to this end, is we will give you what we call the Three-Fifths Clause. We're not going to count African Americans as a whole person, at least in the political sense. They will account for 3/5 of a person. And so therefore what you have is a Three-Fifths Clause that says it's a fraction, it's a multiplier, 3/5 for every person that you can produce. That's the number that will go to Congress. So I'm just making it simple. If you've got 100 African American slaves, you multiply that by 3/5, and although you're not sending 100 representatives to Congress, you are adding more. And so once again, from my perspective, this isn't a good thing, not only because those people are not giving any kind of representation in Congress, but also because it really gives states like South Carolina undue political power. Okay? Now, all of this is in the name of ratifying the Constitution. For your notes, what I want you to have next to Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Okay? What the Constitution was the governing document where everything would refer to when it comes to how much power Congress has, how much power the president has, and what his specific job titles entail. Okay? But for your notes, what the Constitution does is it really strengthens the power of the federal government, sets up a much stronger federal government to the point where it can tax people directly. It puts it in charge of military defense. It puts it in charge of resolving differences between the states and regulating external commerce. So if we want a tax on British textile goods, not only will that tax be collected in Massachusetts, where it's really popular, it'll also be collected in Georgia, where it's not so popular. Okay? Now, if you're a state like New York or Virginia, you might be quite hesitant of this Constitution, because the simple fact of the matter is, New York needed the United States a lot less, not as much, as the United States needed New York. And keep in mind, one of the things that we had to have before the Constitution can be the law of the land is the ratification of a majority of states. In this case, we needed 9 states to sign on the dotted line, to ratify the Constitution before the Constitution can be the law of the land. And so, to get people like New York and Virginia to really warm up to the idea of the Constitution, there was a promise that there would be amendments, there would be a Bill of Rights, what Congress would not pass laws for in the aftermath of this ratification. I'll touch upon that in just a second. But for the time being, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Federalist Papers. Now, the Federalist Papers were a series of articles in New York. It's important that you write down New York. New York newspapers designed to get New Yorkers to warm up to the idea of a supreme law of the land, the benefits involved in a stronger central government. They were written primarily by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, and basically what they do is they outline the benefits of having a stronger central government. So, in one instance, James Madison talks about this idea of factions, what he calls factions. Today we might call them political interest groups. And he notes that while these factions might be small in terms of numbers, the people that make them up are relatively small, they're very, very powerful in terms of economic power, financial power. And so therefore these factions could wiggle into the state apparatus and exploit the fact that you don't have a strong central governing body for their own selfish purposes. But if you have a strong central government and all states have to succumb, have to be governed by this one centralized body, it makes it infinitely more difficult for factions to exploit this democratic, small d democratic system. And so ultimately these Federalist Papers, similar to the case that I just pointed out, are successful in getting New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution. Bigger states like Virginia, New York, Massachusetts go ahead and ratify the Constitution, and that brings us to 9 states. Okay? And so in 1788, the Constitution becomes the law of the land, but it's followed up by another document, 10 amendments to the Constitution. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and what they do is they guarantee our civil rights and our civil liberties. Again, they guarantee our civil rights and our civil liberties. And so the First Amendment says that you have the right to free speech, freedom of assembly, peaceful assembly, of course, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of petition. These are laws that Congress cannot make a law against, but they're also not absolute. For instance, if you are a pagan, if that's the religion that you choose to practice, nobody's saying that you can't worship a tree. It's just that you can't have animal sacrifices in certain contexts. You certainly can't have human sacrifices. I mean, that would be a good example of freedom of religion not being absolute. I mean, you can't have a religion that infringes upon somebody else's right to life, for instance. The next amendment that I'd like you to be mindful of would be the Second Amendment, right? The Second Amendment emphasizes that we'll have a well-regulated militia, and you would have the right to bear arms, to have arms, guns, to maintain that well-regulated militia. But again, the words well-regulated are right there in the Second Amendment, and what that means is it's not absolute. It's not like you can have any gun that you choose to have. It's not an open-ended right like that. Third Amendment, things about quartering soldiers. There would be no quartering of soldiers. If you were following along in the Revolutionary period, you might understand why. You know, the king is forcing Bostonians, for instance, to build these barracks and maintain these barracks. And then, of course, the Fourth Amendment. You have a reasonable right to privacy. You don't have to incriminate yourself. In other words, unless the police officer suspects you of committing a crime, it's not as if he or she can just search through your car just because they pulled you over. They'll need a warrant. Where does that come from? Well, the simple fact of the matter was a lot of these British law enforcement officials were just issuing writs of assistance, jumping on merchant ships and seizing what they saw to be contraband, and then really throwing the legal book, so to speak, at people for violating this law. Okay? The Fifth Amendment, you have the right not to incriminate yourself. You have, if you are accused of crime and you're in court and you are asked a question, really simple, did you commit this crime? What you can do is plead the Fifth. You can say, on the basis that this may or may not, you're supposed to not take that into consideration, it may or may not incriminate me, I refuse to answer the question. Okay? The Sixth Amendment, you have the right to a trial by jury. Now, again, this kind of invokes the Revolutionary period in the sense that there were things that were being done, these vice admiralty courts where the British would sail you out into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where a British judge would serve as judge, jury, and executioner. This guaranteed your right to a jury. Now, you could waive that right if you want to, but it's yours to waive. The Seventh Amendment, the right to a speedy trial. In other words, you have a shelf life in terms of how long the state can hold you, can arrest you, before they have to formally charge you. And when that time expires, they either have to formally charge you or they have to let you go. Okay? So that's a speedy trial. It has to be done in a somewhat timely fashion. You can't just throw somebody in jail and, throw away the key. Anyway, the Eighth Amendment. Provisions against cruel and unusual punishment. So if you have an inmate that is Jewish, a practicing Jewish inmate, prisoner, it would be illegal, as far as the Bill of Rights are concerned, to force them to eat pork products. Pork in the Jewish faith is not a kosher food, and therefore anybody that is forced to eat it is technically violating their religious beliefs. And so therefore it's considered cruel and unusual punishment and is not legal. Okay. Ninth Amendment, the rule of the Constitution. If it's spelled out in the Constitution, it applies to everywhere in the United States because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Lastly, the rule of the states. If it's not spelled out in the Constitution, at that point the states can implement their own laws to deal with their societies as they see fit. Because as the Articles of Confederation noted, who knows Virginians better than the people that are governing in Virginia? Okay? So at any rate, now what we've got by 1788 is a legal infrastructure that will serve as the governing document of the United States. But we're still a long way from being out of the woods when it comes to the way that the United States is being governed. Okay? And so when we pick it up, we'll be talking about the establishment of presidential cabinets and some of the more finer details of American democracy as it relates to the infrastructure of all of it.